Samuel Harrison had always believed that being a firefighter was more than just a job, it was a calling. For 28 years, he had served with the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, facing flames that devoured homes, forests, and sometimes even lives. He had seen things most people couldn't imagine, and yet, through it all, he had always felt God's presence guiding him. Even after retiring, he remained involved, training the next generation of firefighters, passing on the wisdom earned through years on the front lines. On the morning of January 15, 2025, Samuel woke up early, ready for another day of service. He was scheduled to give a fire safety training session at a local church, a small but important effort to help communities prepare for the ever-worsening wildfire seasons. He grabbed his keys, kissed his wife on the forehead as she slept, and headed out. The drive was familiar, the morning air crisp and the sun barely rising over the hills. He had made this trip countless times, but today something felt different. As he drove along the winding roads leading into town, an unease settled in his chest. It started as a dull pressure, easy to dismiss, but within minutes the sensation grew stronger. His breath became shallow, and a tightness spread across his ribcage. He clenched the steering wheel, trying to shake it off. Maybe it was just stress, or maybe he hadn't eaten enough that morning. But then the pain sharpened, radiating down his left arm, and he knew this was something far more serious. His vision blurred, and his heartbeat pounded in his ears like distant thunder. Panic crept in, but a deeper instinct took over. He needed to stop the car. With the last bit of control he had, he veered onto the side of the road, putting the truck into park before slumping forward. Darkness rushed in, swallowing everything. The first thing he noticed wasn't the absence of pain, but the overwhelming presence of light. It wasn't like sunlight, nor the fluorescent glare of a hospital room. This light was different. It surrounded him, filled him, and yet it didn't blind. It was warm, alive and impossibly vast, stretching beyond anything his mind could comprehend. Then he saw himself, or rather, his body. It was still slumped over in the driver's seat, unmoving as cars passed by, oblivious. A woman, jogging, on the opposite side of the road, paused, concern flashing across her face. She reached for her phone, dialing emergency services, but Samuel felt strangely detached from it all. There was no fear, no panic, only an indescribable peace. Something was pulling him upward. It wasn't like floating, nor was it like flying. It was as if reality itself was shifting, layer by layer, revealing something deeper, something more real than anything he had ever known. He wasn't alone. There was a presence, powerful and undeniable, surrounding him, filling every fiber of his being with love so complete, so absolute, that it made every earthly concern feel insignificant. He knew without being told that he was in the presence of God. The overwhelming light surrounded Samuel, yet it did not burn or blind. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced, alive and infinite, carrying with it a presence that radiated love, peace, and authority beyond human comprehension. Every doubt, every fear, every worry he had ever carried seemed to dissolve into nothingness. He felt known completely and utterly, as if every moment of his life had been laid bare. And yet, despite this complete exposure, there was no shame, only love. Then he became aware of movement. It was not like walking, flying, or floating. It was as though layers of existence were peeling away, each revealing something deeper, something truer than the last. He felt himself being drawn forward, or perhaps upward, though there was no real sense of direction as he had once understood. The presence surrounding him grew even stronger, and suddenly he was no longer alone. Before him stood a figure of indescribable radiance. His form was both familiar and beyond comprehension, his face carrying a presence that held eternity itself. His eyes, though deeper than the universe, locked onto Samuel with an intensity that was both overwhelming and comforting. In that instant, Samuel knew exactly who stood before him. It was Jesus Christ. There were no spoken words, yet Samuel understood everything being conveyed to him. The voice of Jesus was not a sound, but a direct transmission of truth into his soul, each word carrying layers of meaning far beyond the limits of human language. "My child," Jesus said, "you have been brought here because you must see what is truly happening. You must understand, and you must share what you learn." At that moment, the space around them shifted. They were no longer standing in endless light. Instead, they were looking down at the earth, at California. But Samuel was seeing it in a way he never had before. He could see the state not just in the physical sense, but in a layered reality where the spiritual and material coexisted. Fires raged across vast stretches of land, their flames bright and violent, but it was what lay beneath them that truly shook him. Within the fires, there were shadows. Not the shadows cast by trees or buildings, but living, moving entities. They twisted and curled within the flames, feeding off them, growing stronger as the destruction spread. These were not ordinary fires, and these were not natural forces. At work, Samuel's heart pounded as he watched the scene unfold before him. He had spent his life battling wildfires, studying them, understanding their causes and patterns, but nothing he had ever encountered prepared him for what he was witnessing now. These fires were being fueled by something unseen, something far more dangerous than dry conditions or strong winds. "These are not merely natural disasters," Jesus explained, his voice heavy with sorrow. "They are manifestations of a deeper corruption, a reflection of what is happening in the hearts of my people. The enemy has taken root where faith has been abandoned, where truth has been cast aside. These fires are not only burning the land, they are consuming souls." Samuel felt a deep sorrow wash over him as he saw what Jesus meant. The flames were not just consuming forests and homes, they were feeding on something much deeper. The spiritual darkness intertwined with the fires, spreading wherever there was division, greed, fear, and moral decay. Then Jesus directed Samuel's attention to specific areas of California, places where the destruction was most severe. "Watch carefully," he commanded. As Samuel looked closer, he saw how these regions were covered in a dense, almost suffocating darkness. It was a darkness unlike anything he had ever seen, shifting and pulsating as though alive. And within it he saw things moving, beings, creatures, entities that he could not name. They were not demons in the way he had once imagined, not horned figures or grotesque monsters. These were more insidious, more cunning. They wove themselves into the very fabric of the flames, whispering, spreading, manipulating. They were not setting the fires themselves. They didn't need to. Instead, they influenced the decisions that led to the fires, the neglect, the greed, the recklessness, the apathy. They fed on human choices, on the slow erosion of faith, on the prioritization of worldly desires over spiritual truth. Jesus' voice broke through the horror of what Samuel was witnessing. "The people do not see," he said. "They believe these disasters are merely the result of chance, of nature, of science. But what they do not understand is that the spiritual and the physical are intertwined. What happens in the heart of a man shapes the world around him." Samuel felt an ache in his soul as he saw what this meant. The fires were not just flames, they were symptoms of a deeper sickness, a world turning away from God, allowing darkness to take hold in ways unseen. But then Jesus showed him something else. Among the destruction, there were points of light, small at first but unmistakable. These were places where people still held on to their faith, where communities still gathered in genuine prayer, where families still sought God first. And in these places, the darkness struggled to take hold. The contrast was undeniable. In some areas, the flames raged uncontested, but in others they weakened. The spiritual forces behind them could not gain the same foothold, where faith stood strong. Samuel's mind reeled as he tried to process it all. The fires, the entities, the battle that had been raging beyond human sight. And then a final realization struck him like a thunderbolt. If this was true, if what he was seeing was the true nature of what was happening, then fighting these fires with physical means alone would never be enough. No amount of technology, no firefighting strategy, no government intervention could stop them if the real cause remained unaddressed. Then Jesus turned to Samuel, his eyes filled with both sorrow and urgency. Now you understand, but this is only the beginning. What you do with this knowledge will determine what happens next. Samuel felt as though he was suspended between two worlds, caught in a place where time did not exist, where the very fabric of reality pulsed with an energy he could not explain. The presence before him was overwhelming yet comforting, powerful yet deeply personal. He did not need to ask who it was. He already knew. Jesus stood before him, though not in the way he had ever imagined. There were no paintings, no stained glass depictions that could ever capture the reality of what he was seeing. His presence filled everything, radiating a love so intense that it should have been unbearable, yet it only brought peace. His eyes, burning with infinite wisdom and compassion, held Samuel in place, piercing into the very core of his being. Samuel wanted to speak, to ask 1,000 questions, but words were unnecessary. Jesus' voice, though not spoken aloud, filled his mind with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. "You have been brought here because you must understand what is truly happening," the voice echoed within Samuel's soul. "What you are about to see, you must share." In an instant, the space around them changed. The light that had once surrounded them dimmed, and suddenly they were standing above the earth, looking down upon California. But this was no ordinary view from the heavens. Samuel could see the land, not just as it was, but as it existed beyond human perception. He saw layers of reality stacked upon one another, the physical world interwoven with something deeper, something unseen. Wildfires raged across the state, their flames devouring forests, homes, entire towns. But the fires were more than just natural disasters. As Samuel looked closer, he saw dark, shifting forms moving within the flames, twisting and coiling like living shadows. They were not human, nor animal, nor anything he had ever seen before. They pulsed with an energy that felt ancient, malevolent and hungry. Jesus directed Samuel's gaze to the areas where the fires burned hottest, where destruction was most severe. At first, it seemed random. Some fires sparked by lightning, others by human negligence. But then he saw the truth. These dark entities did not ignite the flames themselves. They did not need to. Instead, they whispered, influenced, manipulated. They fed on fear, on apathy, on the moral decay that had seeped into society like a slow poison. Every time a politician turned a blind eye to corruption, every time a family abandoned their faith for the empty promises of the world, every time greed outweighed compassion, these entities grew stronger. "This is not merely fire," Jesus said. "It is a reflection of what has taken root in the hearts of many. The physical world burns because the spiritual world is already ablaze." Samuel felt a weight settle on his chest, heavier than anything he had carried in his years as a firefighter. He had always believed in good and evil, in God and the devil, but never had he seen it so clearly, so undeniably. "How do we stop it?" Samuel asked, his voice trembling. "How do we fight something like this?" Jesus' gaze did not waver. Not with water, not with science, not with human strength alone. These fires cannot be extinguished by physical means because they are not merely physical. They are symptoms of a deeper sickness, one that only repentance and faith can heal. Samuel looked again at the fires and noticed something he hadn't seen before. Scattered across the state, among the destruction, were pockets of light, small but brilliant. As he focused on them, he saw what lay beneath. These were places where people still gathered in true faith, where prayer was not just a ritual, but a lifeline, where communities supported each other not for personal gain, but out of genuine love. The dark entities writhed and recoiled in these areas, unable to take hold. The flames that reached these places still burned, but they did not consume. Samuel understood. These were strongholds of spiritual resilience, places where God's presence had not been abandoned, where light still pushed against the encroaching darkness. "But it is fading," Jesus said, sorrow evident in his voice. "For too long my people have chosen comfort over conviction, appearance over substance, tradition over truth. The church has allowed itself to become complacent, distracted, afraid to stand for what is right, and so the darkness grows." Samuel saw more visions unfold before him. He saw people scrolling endlessly through their phones, consuming empty distractions while their souls withered. He saw churches focused more on entertainment than salvation, pastors afraid to speak hard truths for fear of offending. He saw families disconnected, communities fractured, faith treated as an accessory rather than the foundation of life. "This is why the fires cannot be stopped," Jesus continued, "not until the hearts of the people return to me, until they see that no government, no technology, no human effort can fix what is ultimately a spiritual disease." Samuel felt desperation rise within him. He had spent his life fighting fires, believing in prevention, in planning, in strategy. But what he was seeing now was a battle that could not be fought with water hoses and containment lines. It required something far more powerful. "What must I do?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Tell them," Jesus said. "Tell them everything you have seen. Tell them there is still time, but not much. If they do not turn back, if they do not choose me over the world, the fires will continue until there is nothing left to burn." Jesus' final words carried a weight that Samuel could feel pressing against his soul. They must decide. The time for choosing is now. Samuel looked down at the world below, at the devastation, at the people still oblivious to the battle raging around them. And then, in an instant, the vision shattered, the light faded, the presence withdrew, and he felt himself being pulled away down, back into the darkness that had first taken him. He gasped for air. Samuel's lungs burned as he gasped for air, his body convulsing as if fighting to hold on to the life that had just returned to him. The blinding light was gone, replaced by the dim, sterile glow of ambulance lights flickering above him. Voices swirled around, sharp and urgent, but they felt distant, muffled by the overwhelming weight of what he had just experienced. His heart pounded, not from the shock of nearly dying, but from the message still seared into his soul. Hands pressed against his chest, stabilizing him as paramedics worked frantically, their expressions shifting from fear to stunned relief. One of them, a woman with dark hair tied back in a tight ponytail, leaned over him, eyes wide. "You're back," she whispered, almost to herself. 9 minutes. You were gone for 9 minutes. Samuel's mind raced. 9 minutes. But what he had seen, what he had been shown, had felt like an eternity. The weight of it pressed on him, heavier than anything he had ever carried. He tried to speak, but his throat was raw, his body weak. He wasn't ready to be here, not after what he had just witnessed. The paramedics lifted him into the ambulance, strapping him down as they checked his vitals. The woman kept looking at him, as if expecting him to slip away again. He could feel it, the way they hovered over him, waiting for some sign that he might not make it. But Samuel knew with absolute certainty that his body had returned for a reason. He wasn't meant to die that day. The ride to the hospital was a blur. Sirens wailed in the distance, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying the vision again and again. The fires, the darkness, the truth that so few could see. He had to tell them. He had to make them understand. By the time he arrived at the hospital, exhaustion had settled deep into his bones, but something stronger pushed him forward. As doctors surrounded him, checking his vitals, speaking in hurried voices, he felt a fire inside him, one that no physical weakness could extinguish. He had been given a message, and he could not stay silent. A nurse leaned over him, pressing a cool hand against his forehead. "Mr. Harrison, can you hear me? You've had a cardiac event, but you're stable now. You're lucky to be alive." Lucky? He almost laughed. This wasn't luck. He licked his dry lips, forcing his voice to work. "I need to talk to someone." The nurse smiled softly. "We'll notify your family." "No," Samuel croaked, shaking his head weakly. I need to tell someone what I saw." The nurse exchanged a glance with the doctor, concern flickering in her eyes. "Mr. Harrison, you've been through a traumatic experience. It's normal to have strange thoughts when coming out of a near death." "I wasn't hallucinating," he interrupted, his voice hoarse but firm. "I saw Jesus." Silence. The doctor scribbled something on his chart. The nurse hesitated, and Samuel could see it in their eyes. They didn't believe him. They thought he was just another near-death patient rambling about the afterlife, a mind trying to make sense of trauma. But this wasn't the fog of a dying brain. This was real. More real than the hospital bed he was lying in, more real than the wires attached to his chest. The urgency clawed at him. "Listen to me," he rasped. "The fires, they're not just natural disasters. There's something else, something spiritual." The doctor cleared his throat. "Mr. Harrison, I think it's best if we focus on your recovery for now. Let's run some tests and then—" "No," Samuel growled, the frustration giving him strength. He pushed himself up, ignoring the sharp protests of his weakened body. "You don't understand. Jesus showed me what's happening. The fires will keep coming. They'll get worse if people don't wake up." The doctor sighed, stepping back as if trying to assess whether he was dealing with a man who had simply been through too much. "I understand that this must have been a profound experience for you, but perhaps speaking with a counselor—" "You're not listening," Samuel snapped. His chest heaved, pain stabbing through him, but he didn't care. The world needed to hear this. A shadow appeared in the doorway, a new figure, his wife. Her eyes were red, her face pale as she rushed to his side, clutching his hand. "Sam," she whispered, tears spilling over. "I thought I lost you." He squeezed her fingers weakly, grounding himself in the warmth of her touch. He had so much to tell her, so much she needed to know. But how could he possibly put it into words? His voice softened. "I wasn't gone. I was shown something." Her brows furrowed, fear flickering behind her love for him. "Sam, what are you talking about?" He swallowed hard. "The fires, they're warnings. They're not just about droughts or bad weather. There's something deeper, something feeding them. Jesus showed me." She flinched at the name, her grip tightening. "Sam, you just went through a heart attack. You were dead. Maybe your mind—" "No." His voice cut through her doubts. "This wasn't a dream. This wasn't some illusion. It was real. And I have to warn people before it's too late." Tears welled in her eyes again, but this time they weren't just from relief. They were from fear. Not fear of losing him, but fear of what he was saying. Because deep down she knew. She had seen the world change. The darkness creeping into places that once felt safe. The emptiness behind people's eyes. The way the fires had become more frequent. More devastating, more uncontrollable. She had ignored it, but now she couldn't. Samuel looked into her eyes, pleading. People need to turn back, not to routines, not to empty religion, to him, to real faith. Otherwise, The fires won't stop. His wife trembled, staring at him as if he had become someone else. Maybe he had. Maybe he wasn't the same man who had left the house that morning. But how could he be? He had seen the truth. Samuel sat in the hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, his wife's hand still wrapped around his. The weight of what he had seen, of what he had been told, pressed down on him like a fire in his chest. He had to share it. He had to warn them. But how? Who would listen? The doctors thought he was confused. The nurses treated him with gentle pity. Even his wife, despite the fear in her eyes, struggled to believe. But he had no choice. The message was too urgent. Outside his window, the California sky burned red, with another wildfire raging in the distance. He could almost hear the whispers, feel the darkness spreading. It was beginning, just as Jesus had shown him. His wife shifted beside him. "What do we do, Sam?" Her voice trembled. He turned to her, gripping her hand tighter. "We pray. We tell everyone who will listen. We don't stop, no matter what." She nodded, swallowing hard, and he saw it, something shifting in her eyes. Not fear, not doubt, something stronger. Faith. It had to start somewhere, one soul at a time. And so it began.